What is food security? It's a huge question that can be addressed by answering other questions. Like, how can agriculture help solve the threat of climate change? Can a resilient food system start with a seed? How can technology help farmers run better businesses? How can gender equality drive food security? Can food security bring security for farmers, for economies, for the environment, for humanity? Enter the Global Food Security Index, an annual report developed by the Economist Intelligence Unit and sponsored by Corteva Agriscience. The index considers food availability, affordability, and quality and safety alongside natural resources and resilience across 113 countries. It looks beyond the surface of food security to the factors that drive it, so we can all ask smarter questions and work together to find smarter answers.
Hello, and welcome to this webinar launching the Economist Intelligence Unit's Global Food Security Index 2020. Thank you for joining us. I'm Claire Casey, Global Head of Public Policy and Thought Leadership at the EIU, and I'll be your host at today's event. Today, we'll share highlights from the index and explore the factors that drive food security, hearing from different stakeholders and experts in the field. As we're all aware, the COVID-19 pandemic has exposed and indeed exacerbated some existing vulnerabilities and inequalities. It's a reminder that our food systems are fragile. And on a positive note, this awareness and the urgency that is building may be spurring the adoption of solutions that address the structural gaps that exist today so we can build a stronger, more resilient, and sustainable global food system going forward. I'm joined today by Pratima Singh, the project lead for the Global Food Security Index. Pratima, before we go any further, can you just remind everybody on the call what this index is?
Absolutely. So the EIU's Global Food Security Index, or GFSI for short, is an annual index that examines the underlying drivers of food security. And we do this by dividing our index into 4 categories, looking at food affordability, food availability, quality and safety, and natural resources and resilience. We measure food security across 113 countries in 5 regions: Asia Pacific, Europe, Latin America, and the Middle East and Africa, as well as North America. The index is been running for 9 years now, and it's used essentially as a benchmarking tool by governments and policymakers, by academics, nonprofits and NGOs, as well as private sector players, essentially because it really dives into the engagement between different stakeholders in ensuring food security. And it highlights how different stakeholders can come together and contribute to eradicating hunger and global food insecurity.
That's great, Pratima. I'm really looking forward to discussing this year's results with you. Shortly, we'll be hearing opening remarks from the CEO of Corteva Agriscience, Jim Collins. The GFSI has been supported by Corteva since its launch in 2012. In addition to providing a high-level overview of results, we have a terrific panel of experts who will help us answer the question, how can we feed the world and save the planet? We'll discuss how we can build a more sustainable, resilient, and fair food system. After this, you'll hear a keynote address from Dr. Agnes Calibata, the United Nations Special Envoy to the 2021 Food System Summit. Dr. Calibata is calling for a transformation in the way we produce, process, and consume food. And finally, we're bringing you an opportunity to travel to the future. You'll hear from a group of visionaries who'll be reporting back from the year 2030, telling us how technological innovation helped create a food-secure world. Pratima and I will be here throughout, linking it all together. And in fact, throughout this event, we'd love to hear from you. This platform has a Q&A chat function, so please do submit your questions as they arise. Every now and then, to keep it interactive, I'll throw out a quick multiple choice quiz question for you to answer. So if you're watching live, you can use the poll function to pick the correct answer. And if you're tuning into a recording, have a guess anyway. In just a few minutes, we'll talk about the key findings from the Global Food Security Index. But before we do so, I'm going to hand it over to Jim Collins, CEO of Corteva Agriscience.
Thank you, Claire. It is my great pleasure to welcome you all to the launch of the Economist Intelligence Unit's 2020 Global Food Security Index. Corteva is proud to be the exclusive sponsor of the index, which is now in its 9th year. We are encouraged to see how it's become a trusted resource for organizations, governments, and communities around the world who are working to build a more food-secure future. It's clear that unprecedented demands are being put on agriculture today. Farmers are being asked to grow more food on less acreage and with fewer natural resources. They must also contend with growing climate volatility, with floods, fires, drought, and extreme weather. When we also factor in the financial pressure that farmers are experiencing due to trade disputes and market fluctuations, we are facing a future where farmers will continue to deal with challenges. For thousands of years, farmers have been proud stewards of the land, but the challenges they are facing today would be unimaginable to previous generations. So what can we do? At Corteva, our purpose is to enrich the lives of those who produce and those who consume, ensuring progress for generations to come, which is why we are focused on making agriculture more productive, resilient, and sustainable. I'm optimistic that through our 14 industry-leading sustainability goals, we can succeed. The 2020 Global Food Security Index makes clear that the solutions for food insecurity go well beyond the farm. Even so, I believe that agricultural resilience and sustainability lie at the heart of securing our food supply. I am proud to welcome you to this launch event. My greatest hope is that the insights and intelligence that the index offers will inspire and inform your many efforts to build a more food secure and sustainable world for us all. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. Okay, before we dive into the findings of the index, I'm going to give you a chance to answer a key question. Here it is on your screen. Between 2018 and today, global food security has remained the same, declined, or improved? Vote now. If you're joining live, you should see a pop-up poll on your screen. Okay, time's up. And the answer is global food security has unfortunately declined since 2018. That is, in fact, one of the key findings of the 2020 index. Pratima, tell us a bit more.
Sure thing, Claire. Yes, in fact, the 2020 Global Food Security Index shows an overall decline in food security. We'll go into more details of this in just a little bit, but essentially the gist is after improving consistently for 7 years, from 2012 all the way through to 2018, the overall food security environment deteriorated for a second year in a row in 2020.
As you say, we'll dig into those details, but before we do that, let's take a step back and discuss the approach to the index. I know the EIU has continuously been improving the index since its inception. Can you tell us about any changes there were to the 2020 edition?
We've made a couple of changes to the index this year, and to your point, essentially to ensure that it remains a powerful and relevant tool to measure food security every year. We've introduced a few inequality-linked indicators, including gender inequality and inequality-adjusted income levels. But the biggest change we've made this year in the methodology is that for the first time, the GFSI has incorporated the natural resources and resilience category as a core pillar of the main index. This is not a new category. We've had this category since 2017 when it was first introduced as an adjustment factor to the baseline scores. But this year we have included it as part of the main index. The reason for this is really to ensure that climate risk becomes a core part of the dialogue on food security, and the two should no longer really be considered distinct and somewhat connected issues. They are in fact inextricably linked.
This really speaks to the fact that climate risk and natural resources and resilience are a big part of the conversation on food security. Does the change in methodology affect the way we track progress over time and compare over years?
Yes and no. We can't essentially compare the 2019 edition of the index to the 2020 edition due to these methodological changes. But we have seen some shifts in countries' rankings due to this inclusion of the fourth category. However, the 2020 index, this edition, we've backdated all the scores for 113 countries for the entire index period. from 2012 all the way through to 2020 using this new methodology. So essentially what this means is that we can measure progress over years in this latest 2020 model. And this was because we wanted to ensure and allow for year-on-year comparability, which we know is a very valuable feature of the GFSI.
So let's explore the findings a little. You've mentioned that we break down the analysis by the factors of affordability, availability, quality, and safety, and natural resources and resilience. Can we dig a little deeper into these? What are some of the key takeaways of the 2020 index?
Absolutely. This index, it was hugely important to work on it because of all the factors that we discussed previously. And also something that I mentioned, one of the main findings was that the overall food security environment declined for the second year in a row. And we wanted to kind of really dig deeper into that and also realized while we were doing that, that even before the pandemic, we saw that the global food security environment was deteriorating. So in 2019, we saw a bit of a deterioration. And then in 2020, we saw a second dip. This is after improving consistently for 7 years, from 2012 all the way through to 2018. In 2020, 62 countries saw their performance drop compared to the previous year, to 2019. The main driver of this decline was, unsurprisingly, affordability, the first category of affordability, which logged the most significant deterioration in performance in 2020. Out of 113 countries, 66 saw their performance drop in this category. And that's because evidently affordability took a significant hit in 2020, in this year. We had falling incomes, rising poverty levels, and lack of effective food safety nets, particularly in times of crisis, that all contributed to this. I want to take a pause here and really reflect, because the lesson here is that policymakers can improve performance on food security by focusing on providing stable, transparent, and well-targeted support programs that can really withstand the test of unexpected economic shocks and crises. In normal circumstances, we don't really feel these gaps quite as acutely. But in times of crisis, these structural inequities are felt deeply.
And these impacts are interconnected. We know the pandemic will have significant implications for food security, not just in 2020, but beyond. We know that a drop in affordability usually leads to a deterioration in the quality and safety of food. People shift to cheaper foods with longer shelf lives, with lower nutritional value. In these circumstances, having effective nutritional strategies in place can help governments identify the needs of high-risk groups. What does the index tell us about that?
That's exactly right, Claire. You really hit the nail on the head here. Having these food security strategies and nutritional strategies in place can really help cushion some of the blow. However, the GFSI finds that currently only 54 countries have a national food security strategy in place. While that number has increased over the years, we have seen some countries add in and really prioritize this. There is a lot of room for improvement still. Policymakers should continue to prioritize putting food security on the national agenda. A majority of countries, even today, 82 out of the 113, also lack dedicated food security agencies to help them design, prioritize, and implement such strategies. This is really a policy lever that governments can utilize to improve their food security environments. Another interesting finding, this is, I promise, one of the last ones, is one that really connects availability and natural resources and resilience. It's that several countries, and the usual ones are countries like Morocco and Sri Lanka that come to mind, but several countries have been facing extreme volatility in agricultural production over the last few years. This year, in 2020, the GFSI finds that 49 countries experienced higher volatility in agricultural production between 2019 and 2020. The main driver of this really is climate-related factors like droughts and extreme weather. And I want to point out that this is not just countries in Asia or Africa. These are countries like Norway, Sweden, and Australia that have also demonstrated that risks to climate can really affect agricultural production in these countries. What we recommend, what we highlight is that policy commitment to adaptation, tech innovation, agricultural R&D can help countries to prepare for these environmental risks across the globe. Essentially, to sum it all up, the index finds that there is a compounding effect of the pandemic, structural inequalities, and climate change that has led to a heightened risk of food insecurity.
The current crisis, COVID-19, which is certainly one of the largest economic, health, and social crises in recent history, has illuminated some of those structural issues that will help us adapt to the longer-term crisis we are facing as a planet, which is climate change. So a difficult moment, but one that will help us prepare to surmount the challenges ahead. Thank you, Pratima. We will continue this conversation in a bit. Time to shift the conversation towards practical solutions. In particular, we want to address agriculture and food production, because as we're all aware, farmers and food producers are facing multiple pressures. There will be more mouths to feed. The global population will be 10 billion by the middle of the century. We're seeing increasingly volatile weather and frequent disruptions to supply chains. And all of this will be happening while farmers are seeking to run profitable businesses and be an engine for inclusive economic and social development. So the question we're asking, in a nutshell, is how can we feed the world and save the planet? Joining us are 4 people who are working towards solutions that can simultaneously deliver food security, environmental sustainability, and economic opportunity. From the World Resources Institute, we have Wanjira Maathai, who joins us from Nairobi, Kenya, where she's the regional director for Africa. And from Manila in the Philippines, we have Cherry Atilano, who's a founding farmer and CEO of Agria, which works with farming and fishing families on climate-smart practices. Cherry's also part of the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition. From Pretoria, South Africa, we have John Purchase, who's the CEO of the Agricultural Business Chamber of South Africa, which works to ensure that agribusiness plays a constructive role in the country's economic growth, development, and transformation. And finally, Mark Engel, Unilever's Chief Supply Chain Officer, who's working with hundreds of suppliers, many of them farmers and food producers, for over 400 brands spanning 190 countries. Thank you all for joining us today. Before we get to solutions, let's get a sense of some of the pressures that farmers and food producers are facing. Wanjira, to start out, could you remind us what's at stake here? What's the scope of the challenge, and how urgently does the world need to change the way we produce and consume food?
Well, thank you for that. And in more ways than one, everything is at stake. The world needs to change the way we produce, move, and use food. The entire global food system was already at risk, but climate change makes this even worse. And some of the challenges include the fact that we have got to, as you said in the beginning, increase the global demand. There will be a 50% increase in the global demand for food in the next 40 years or 30 years, and even larger increases in some of the most food insecure regions. It's about a 3-fold increase in sub-Saharan Africa. So developing countries, for example, are experiencing a lot of increased heat because of climate change. And now, of course, COVID stands to make this even worse.
Mark, Wanjira laid out the scope of the problem. To what extent are you seeing that consumers are becoming aware of how their food is being produced and making demands on manufacturers and farmers?
Yeah, thank you very much. Look, consumers are definitely much more aware. But I think it's also fair to say that you see a big variation depending by age group. We, of course, as a consumer company, do a lot of consumer research. We're seeing that baby boomers in general are not so interested. Generation X is intellectually interested, but much more around food safety and quality and taste. But the millennials, Generation Y and Generation Z, are extremely motivated in this, and they're interested, and even more than that, they will not buy your brand if they are not convinced that your brand makes a positive difference to society at large. And we know that they shop with their passion for making the world a better place in mind, and that's why we're accelerating the purpose of our brands. When you look forward and you just simply look at the demographics, at the numbers and the purchasing power, we will be catering in the next 20 years to Generation Y and Generation Z. So we better step that up.
John, we've heard from Mark and Wanjira some of the pressures on producers. From the perspective of large-scale farmers in South Africa, how are these pressures changing the way food is grown and produced? And what are the sustainable techniques that your members are adopting?
Yes, absolutely. And the pressures of climate change, also what the consumer preferences are. and the just economic pressures that you have with high input costs, etc. You have to drive efficiency, but you have to drive it within a production system of what we call conservation agriculture, climate smart agricultural practices, even precision farming agricultural practices to drive your efficiencies. And then our farmers are becoming very attuned to this. South Africa is well known as a net exporter of food, especially fruits, but also meats and wool, etc., and grains, especially into the southern African region, where we actually provide food security for so many countries around us. So it's critically important that we develop the technologies and the skills that go with producing sufficiently and sustainable. We really do need to create a sustainable and resilient agro-food ecosystems. Everything around that must be sustainable and resilient. And so we have a very strong focus in our production systems on that.
Wonderful. Thank you. Cherry, you're working to bring subsistence farmers and fishermen into small-scale commercial farming in the Philippines. Could you weigh in here? To what extent are small-scale farmers part of the solution for delivering food security, environmental sustainability, and economic opportunity?
Thank you, Claire, for that good question. Our company works with around 30,000 smallholder farmers in the Philippines, and they have an average of 1 hectare to 1.5 hectares. What we do basically is education is very key to our work in terms of bringing these farmers from subsistence to creating a community of commercial scale. So what we do, we basically teach farmers in 3 things in our farm school. We have values formation in terms of changing their mindsets and how, it doesn't matter if you have a small piece of land, but collective effort matters and working with other smallholder farmers. Second one is we teach them on sustainable agricultural practices, mostly regenerative farming with respect to environment, because at the end of the day, the environment is basically their savior in terms of what they want to do with their land. So a lot of our technologies are actually very geared towards a strong adaptation, and it's not intimidating, and mostly co-developed by these farmers also. And the last one that is very, very important in terms of economics is we teach them on financial literacy program, including their wives and their children. This is actually the key on how to make, the values formation and the sustainable agriculture, mostly as a whole in terms of our approach. The financial literacy for us is key. It's because it's also like their ticket to get support from the government or have access to financial support from rural banks present in different provinces.
Wonderful. Thank you. So we've heard from John and Cherry what farmers are doing today. Wanjira, could you take us to the future? What does a future sustainable food system look like?
Well, the truth of the matter is, the good news, I should say, is that it is possible, I think, to achieve a sustainable food future. But the urgency of getting there is real. We've got to act fast, and we've got to move in a number of sectors. We have great opportunities to transform to sustainable and resilient food systems over the next, I would say, 10 years. This is the critical decade of action on a number of issues, including this one. Now, I want to share that there are 2 reports that WRI, the organization that I work for, published recently, Creating a Sustainable Food Future and then Growing Better, the 10 critical transitions to transform food and land use. Now, they both show how to take us into a more sustainable future and the critical transitions that are needed to transform our food and land use systems, some of those practices and ways of organizing ourselves to ensure that all the activities that actually produce food are sustainable, are inclusive economically. But I think the most important reality, especially to me, particularly in non-industrialized countries, is the reality that rural women remain the backbone of household food security in our communities. Yes, they only receive a fraction of the land, the credit inputs like seed and fertilizers compared to their male counterparts, but they hold this sector up, and they are the reason, quite frankly, we eat. So you can imagine some research out of UNEP, FAO, and IFAD recently told us that in non-industrialized countries, small-scale farmers produce 80% of the food that we consume, and 70% of small-scale farmers are women. So you can imagine what's at stake. What's at stake is the entire food supply chain, particularly in many of the vulnerable countries. But there's a wonderful paradigm emerging that I love, that I want to share. One, that we have to produce, we have to protect, we have to restore, and we have to reduce.
Terry, is that your experience as well? Does reducing gender inequality in agricultural and food production improve food and nutritional security?
Totally agree with what Manjera was actually saying, because, as she was saying that it's also happening in the Philippines. I observe it a lot in our work, that more inclusion of women, both actually on farm and off farm, is a powerful tool to change and progress our food security issues. So what we do in the Philippines is we have developed programs that are really making the women farmers the core and center of our work. We just launched 2 years ago the program called Forward. It's about finding opportunities and roles for women in agricultural and rural development, for the fact that women experience disproportionate impacts in terms of, of this work, especially of legal barriers. A lot of these women, they're not owning the land. And because of that, they don't have that clear choice on facing decision making on what to do. So in Forward, we focus on providing 3 M's to these women farmers: money, mentor, market. So most of our women farmers are helping in the agribusiness. And aside from that, they're also helping in the value addition on the farm. So for example, if the husbands are the one doing the jobs in the production, the women are trained to do value addition. So they make jams, they make sauces, or they're also involved in the supply chain. And lastly, we focus on mentoring a lot of these women, because we see the fact that every time we work on these women, they are the managers of money at home. So what we like to do with them is how to mentor them on reinvesting it back to their farm to increase their production, at the same time to really have good saving for the family. Last intervention that we do with women is focusing on training them in farm tourism. I think it's an innate nature of women to be nurturing. So our farm tourism programs for our farming communities, they're very successful because of this women intervention that we've been training for years.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. John, how do these practices, these climate-friendly practices, tie into food security? And why is it important that we measure food security? You mentioned that you use the index. How is it valuable?
When we engage government on conservation agriculture, and we've just adopted a policy on conservation agriculture with government, we can use your 4 pillars as well as all the criteria under those pillars. We actually go and try and measure them and try and assess where we are with those pillars and criteria within the Global Food Security Index, so that we can attune government and our stakeholders and our constituencies to make sure that we are following nearly the prescripts of global food security. In other words, the food availability, the food affordability issue. In South Africa, we have a food grant system, basically. The nutritious part that you were mentioning, and food safety. And then obviously now the resource management and the resilience of managing our resources. South Africa is a dry country, arid country. So we use quite a bit of irrigation, but we also then have to look at water use efficiency. So you're using specific technologies like subterranean drip irrigation and various other technologies, so that you're using your resources as efficiently as possible to produce healthy food. So your seed technology, your genetics, your remote sensing, your digitalization of your value chains, all these new technologies that we have enable us to be far more sustainable and far more resilient. And we have to use those, train people and have the skills to use these technologies to meet these challenges that Wanjira and Cherry and Mark all spoke about. So I think I'm very bullish about agriculture, but we've got to get the right policies in place, and we've got to take and create the awareness with all our farmers and all the role players in that food ecosystem, so that they're all part of this movement.
Thank you, John. Mark, I'm going to close with you because large companies like Unilever are really the link for many of us between the food that we eat and the farmer that is producing it. What can large companies like Unilever do to help producers and farmers become more sustainable and do it profitably so that they become engines for inclusive growth? What are your levers of change?
We know we have a very critical role to play in helping transform the global food system. It's widely recognized that the current global food system is inequitable and inefficient. Some people call it broken. Now, we all want our food to be made in ways that are fair to others and better for the planet. It's very difficult to be against that. And Wanjira mentioned the importance of smallholder farmers in numbers, in their contribution to the global supply chain. As he mentioned, 80%. In most of the world, actually the inclusion of farmers and smallholder farmers in sustainable agriculture production is the single most important driver of change for halting deforestation, restoring forest, and helping regenerate nature. In the end, they are the stewards of the land, and they're a pivotal group to take climate action, which in turn is actually the largest threat to food securities. So suppliers are your gateway into what we call the first mile of the supply chain, the fields, the forest, the seas. And the first mile is where most, things are happening. Poverty, livelihoods, deforestation, human rights abuses, carbon release, and all this kind of stuff. So if you want to fix your first mile, you need to work with the players in the first mile through digital solutions and through your suppliers. You need to be setting the standards with your suppliers, like living wages for all. And where are we and where are we going to go to? Unilever committed to have it done by 2030 for all in our value chain, particularly these workers in the first mile. Engagement like in carbon intensity reduction plans or agronomy help, fertilization, these kind of stuff. Rewarding the right actions and attitudes by moving business to the suppliers that are playing ball and moving business away from those who are not. And then the last bit, and I think John said that as well, is there is an enormous role for digital tools. Because, if we are here and the first mile is there and there are 4 or 5 parties in between, the digital tools actually enable you to first make it visible, what is happening in the first mile. It also allows you to reach out directly to the 1.5 million farmers and smallholders that actually need to drive the change.
Thank you, Mark, and to Wanjira, Cherry, John, thank you all for your time today and for sharing your insights with us. This panel has been really thought-provoking and honestly inspiring. It is clear that we need to engage a broad range of stakeholders and dialogue to together develop new and creative ways to build a more sustainable and resilient food system. Pratima, I know you were listening into that conversation. How is all of this reflected in the GFSI?
I was, Claire, and I will say you're absolutely right. It was very inspiring and lots of powerful messages coming through from our panelists. I completely agree. It's critical that we're building very solid, strong, sustainable and resilient food systems going forward. One of the ways that we capture this in the GFSI is by measuring policy commitment to adaptation. So we're examining whether countries are committed to developing early warning measures for the agricultural sector and whether they're investing in some of the climate smart agricultural practices that John mentioned and alluded to as well. From a policy perspective, we're evaluating whether countries have a climate change strategy in place that includes specific measures to cover agricultural adaptation. Because these are factors and policies that are hugely important to encourage innovation and really drive investment in sustainable agricultural systems. So very similar to what Wanjira mentioned as well around the produce, protect, restore and reduce sort of mantra that she's got. It's very critical that we're holding that dear and really kind of looking at countries and how they're performing in executing on those factors.
Another theme that came out of the discussion was how important gender inequality is as part of the solution. How has that been incorporated into the index?
So this is actually the first year that we've incorporated the UNDP, or the United Nations Development Program's gender inequality metric, as part of our indicator on political and social barriers to access, which is under the availability category. Was very nicely and succinctly put in the panel discussion as well, that it's a very well-known fact that globally women are more food insecure than men. And gender inequality has a strong role in women's access to land rights, to farming, but also to nutritional and food security. So we wanted to ensure that policymakers are including this factor as part of the dialogue on food security in their countries. To what Wanjira and Cherry mentioned, this really positions women not only as beneficiaries in this conversation, but really empowers them to be drivers of change as well. Our report on the GFSI has an entire chapter on this, and we've seen some very interesting and promising initiatives coming out of Middle East and Africa to really engage women farmers and promote them as agricultural scientists.
It's true that you can only manage what you measure. So it's good that the index helps shine a light on inequality and gender inequality specifically. So on this topic, we have a quick question for our audience. If you could get ready to answer the question via the pop-up poll for those of you watching live. Pratima mentioned that it's well known that women are more food insecure than men, but by how much? What percentage of women have a higher chance than men of experiencing severe food insecurity? Are women 9% more likely to experience severe food insecurity, 14%, or 27% more likely to experience severe food insecurity? I'll give you time to answer. Okay, time's up. The answer is 27%. That's according to the FAO, which collects data measuring household and individual food security in its Food Insecurity Experience Scale. And by the way, a reminder that you can submit questions throughout today's event, so do send those through. And now I have the great pleasure to introduce Dr. Agnes Kalibata, former Rwandan Minister of Agriculture and now the United Nations Secretary General's Special Envoy to the 2021 Food Systems Summit. She has long been committed to transforming the way we produce and consume food, making it more resilient, fairer, and less harmful to the planet.
Friends and colleagues, it's a pleasure to join you today to launch the Global Food Security Index. From a very young age, I realized that food was everything to everyone. Food influences our performance, our morale, and our aspirations. There's a common saying in Africa, no farmer, no food, no future. But right now, the way we produce, process, and consume food in much of the world is just unsustainable and is not delivering on our development goals. Hunger has been increasing for the last 6 years in a row, even as our ability to produce food has gone up 300% over the last 50 years. Meanwhile, our way of producing food is threatening biodiversity and is contributing to climate change with severe consequences on drought, floods, cyclones, and pests. These natural hazards are costing low and middle income countries around $400 billion each year. This is exactly equivalent to the amount of money we need in the next 10 years to end hunger. Investing only 10% of this amount annually can enable us to develop more inclusive, sustainable, and resilient food systems and to achieve zero hunger. We are out of time. The world is at an inflection point, and now is the moment we must act. The Food Systems Summit is meant to provide such an opportunity. The good news is experts agree that transforming our food systems is one of the best approaches we have to achieve zero hunger, the 2030 agenda, and our climate targets. And indeed, as we are seeing from the Global Food Security Index, these goals are interlinked. We are not starting from scratch, and we can build and scale up good efforts that are already underway around the world. The Global Food Security Index is an example of a tool we have at our disposal. To give you another example, here in Africa, AGRA, the organization I lead, is working with governments and the private sector to increase adoption of improved seeds and agronomic practices among smallholder farmers. We have seen the application of microdosing technologies enable farmers in the Sahel region to increase sorghum and millet yields by 120%. And this has a double benefit to the environment. It prevents excessive use of fertilizers and prevents farmers from using more land, cutting trees to get yields. We need to bring even more ideas on the table from you all. This is the work our action tracks are doing in the Food Systems Summit. We need to form powerful action-oriented partnerships and coalitions that can multiply and deliver across food systems and the SDGs they touch, that can take climate-smart technologies to farmers, that can reduce market failures, that can promote trade and reduce food loss and waste, that can transform the agricultural sector and make it resilient, that can make agri-food systems more inclusive and profitable for smallholder farmers. The Global Food Security Index is a powerful systems tool. It can be used to prioritize action and investments that address food security within a broader lens of sustainability and resilience. It is critical that we view food systems as an opportunity to attain all the SDGs and to deliver on the well-being of people, planet, and on prosperity. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Calibata. Okay, let's shift gears now. For a moment, let's imagine that we are already living in the food secure future that Dr. Calibata is working towards. Thanks to the hard work of scientists, policymakers, farmers, and innovators, we've achieved the UN Sustainable Development Goal number 2 and eliminated hunger. We've asked a group of visionaries and thought leaders to transport themselves into the future to 2030 and send us back a message to tell us what this food secure world looks like and explain how they contributed to the solution.
It is a beautiful February evening in 2030.
The way food is grown, processed, manufactured, and consumed has moved from guesswork to precision.
Through the use of new technological tools, you have managed to increase the growth of world grain productivity.
Farmers grow their crops with fewer insecticides, using less land and water, and reducing greenhouse gas emissions.
We've learned to grow food through genetic modification and all the different technologies. Now everyone anywhere can be sustainable.
We've made great progress on decreasing rural poverty and on fighting hunger.
The vast majority of meat doesn't require killing a single animal, a single drop of antibiotics, or tearing down a single tree.
We've built policy and business models that support human progress for everyone.
Our resourcefulness is now our key to a brighter future of abundance.
The COVID-19 pandemic in 2020-21 provided a sobering imperative for governments, businesses, and society at large for embracing the notion of building back better.
This experience perhaps provided the jolt we needed to rethink our global food supply and make it more resilient and sustainable.
That was a defining moment for an entire generation of teenagers and young adults who now, 10 years later, are serving in leadership positions.
People woke up a bit. They realized that what they eat affects them, their health affects the planet itself, and everything is really interconnected.
We made sure that everybody in rural areas, in remote areas, profited from digital solutions and really created a new class of agro-food entrepreneurs.
Governments had to approach the private sector looking for joint solutions for food security. All remote areas of the world had to be connected. Low-Earth satellites that are getting smaller and cheaper and have made this breakthrough possible.
We helped address the world's food security problem by bringing technology to the entire food supply chain.
By mainstreaming precision farming, Uberizing farm machinery services, putting early warming systems at farmers' fingertips, better connecting about 600 million farms to 8 billion consumers through e-marketing platforms, and by providing widespread access to e-payment systems with seamless transactions.
A whole array of genetic technologies have made the introduction of genes into our crops much more efficient and precise.
By forcing us to start to label the food and by enabling people to purchase products that had that carbon label, that allowed the farmers to start to really focus in and hone in on sequestering carbon.
So we've deployed wireless sensors and predictive analytics to effectively know the expiry date of every bit of grain and produce harvested, stored, and transported.
People began consuming more plant-based foods. They began being even more open to cultured meat. Thousands of companies all around the world employ different technologies in order to make animal protein better.
We don't have to do things the way they've always been done. A new future can be built.
Remember, there are many things that have been really challenging and hard to envision in the past.
Believe that the technical solutions that you have at hand can be scaled up.
Our planet can be a thriving place.
Things will change, and they're going to change because of people like you.
Go for it. Make partners and take action.
I hope you found those messages as inspiring as I did. And while it's forward-looking, it's not fantasy. All of the contributors to that video are already working on these solutions, and many are already in play in the market today. Our food systems are enormously complex, and it's going to take innovation across the value chain to make these big changes. Pratima, how does the index shed light on this factor?
Absolutely, Claire. That was really inspiring and really talks to the fact that tech innovation is critical. We see this in the GFSI as well. It plays a very important role across the food value chain, from production, where we're examining agricultural technology, education and resources, along with things like public expenditure on agricultural R&D, to distribution, where we examine things like crop storage facilities and food safety mechanisms. We know that tech plays a very critical role in ensuring that food loss is minimized. And then, of course, all the way through to consumption. The GFSI report also discusses this role of technology in much more detail, from providing financial services to farmers to being a critical driver of climate-smart agricultural practices. And whether we're thinking about mobile phones or drones, tech is really at the heart of it all.
Excellent. Thank you. And for our final poll, we're going to switch from a quiz to asking your opinion. Which of the 4 categories in the index is of greatest use to you? They're all important, but which is the area that is of most direct use in your work? Affordability, availability, quality and safety, or natural resources and resilience? I'll give you a little time to answer that. Thank you so much for your thoughts. It helps us in understanding how the index is used and how we can continue to improve it over time. Well, that's almost as much time as we have today. But before we sign off, Pratima, can you remind us where we can find this index and the global and regional reports that accompany it, and how we can use the information?
Absolutely. You can go to our website, www.foodsecurityindex.eiu.com, to download the GFSI 2020 model, our global report, as well as the 5 regional reports for more information. You can use the tool on the website to track the performance of the 113 countries that are included in the index across all 4 categories. As a quick reminder, this is the 9th year of the Global Food Security Index. And so you can view the country's performance over the past 9 years to see progress, capture trends in the data, identifies trends and different areas with potential for improvement to drive policy action on this very critical issue.
Excellent. And just to recap some of the key takeaways from the 2020 index, we highlighted 3 key action items. First, we need to establish national food security strategies to identify the needs of high-risk groups and reduce food and nutritional inequalities. Second, we need to protect vulnerable groups from sudden economic shocks by providing transparent and well-targeted support programs, including food safety nets. This is particularly important in times of crisis like we're living through today. And third, From today and this challenge, we are gaining lessons for how to prepare for the challenges to come, namely climate change. We need to drive policy action to adequately prepare for climate change through investment in innovative agricultural practices. Thank you, Pratima, and thank you to the entire EIU GFSI team that works so hard to put this index together each year. I want to extend a big thanks from the EIU to Jim Collins and Corteva AgriScience for your participation in today's event, but more importantly, for your support for the GFSI since its inception 9 years ago. Thank you to all of our speakers who offered their time, their experience, and their insights to our conversation today. And lastly, thanks to you for joining. We look forward to continuing this important conversation.